Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Muito bem-vindos a mais uma sessão do nosso Colóquio CTS, terceira edição, 2023. Temos hoje uma terceira sessão deste ano dedicado aos estudos de inovação, enfim, uma perspectiva crítica. Como sabem, já a nossa cortesia, não é? Quando temos convidados de fora, a sessão será em inglês. Depois, nas gravações, pode inclusive tanto ligar os subtítulos, não é? Também já sabem, enfim, nossa forma aqui de trabalhar, colocam as questões no chat, se possível em inglês, mas se não for, deixem em português mesmo, que a nossa equipa repassa, enfim, ao nosso moderador, serão traduzidas. Bom, eu vou mudar então para o inglês para apresentar o moderador da nossa sessão. Thank you very much and welcoming. Thank you for accepting this invitation. Knowing that you all three, Professor Levinson, Biara Segregants, and our moderator, Lucien von Schomburg, all three have very, very busy schedule. So very, very grateful for you to dispose of your time to be with us in this hour and a half. I will present our moderator, Lucien von Schomburg. Is a young scholar with a sort of a double life, right? Let me add him here to our screen. Is as much in football as in academia, right? And you have here his personal webpage. He is a lecturer at the University of Greenwich Business School, teaching on topics related to philosophy, innovation, and entrepreneurship. He's trained at KU Leuven in Belgium and the Wageningen University in the Netherlands, right? His expertise is on philosophy of innovation, and he's been working with our colleague Vincent Bloch for years. He made his doctoral dissertation entitled Raising the Sail of Innovation, as far as I can remember, philosophical explorations, right, on responsible innovation. And he's always organized a special issue for our journal, Innovation, Critical Studies of Innovation, on responsible innovation in 2022. Very welcome, Lucien. The floor is yours. You are conducting the session and presenting our speakers. Most welcome here to our colleagues here in Brazil and Latin America.
Great, thank you so much, Tiago. I don't think I would have been able to introduce myself better than you have, so thank you for that. And depending on, yes, your current whereabouts, I would like to say to everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very warm welcome to today's session, which indeed marks the third International Colloquium on Science, Technology, and Society. So as Tiago mentioned, my name is Lucien von Schomburg, based at the University of Greenwich in London, and I have the tremendous pleasure of moderating what promises to be an exciting session today. Apologies in advance for any background noises. The university closes on Friday evening, so I'm currently taking this meeting at the local cafe. So it's a good thing I won't actually be doing much of the talking today. Instead, we are privileged to welcome two very exciting speakers, and please forgive my pronunciation, Beata Segerkrans from the University of Helsinki and Lee Vinsel from Virginia Tech in the US. So how it works basically today is I will give each of our speakers a maximum of 30 minutes to give their talk. And after each talk, I will then open the room for questions. I will have a close look at the questions posted in the chat. To allow questions from the audience and welcome an unhurried discussion of approximately 15 minutes or so. So to this end, I really invite you as well to pose your questions and comments in the chat, either in English, but also in Portuguese. I have to admit my Portuguese isn't perfect, but we have a translation team present here today, so they will be able to translate your questions for me, and I can then pose them to our speakers. having said all of this, I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is Beata, a university lecturer in social psychology at the Swedish School of Social Science at the University of Helsinki, and she has a specific background in organizational studies, with her current research mainly contributing to critical studies of care and innovation. Without further ado, I would like to give the virtual floor to Beata, and I wish you good luck with your talk.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. You can hear me now well? Can you? Yeah. Well, you tell me if you can't hear. Yes, good. Thank you. And then my slides are on as well. So thank you very much for that. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me here today. It's wonderful to be here with you in this webinar. And thank you all for coming here today. My title today is A Critical Study of Innovation, the Irresponsibility of Organizational Innovation. And in my presentation, I will draw on research I've done during the last few years, mainly with Professor Karl-Erik Sveiby. He's also from Finland. He's a Swede, but he's at Hanken School of Economics in Helsinki in Finland. So this is mainly the work I've done with him. Here is my agenda for my talk. First, I will present how the concept of innovation is typically understood in research. So I'm interested in how innovation is talked about in research, not so much, I have done studies on innovation in organizations, but this time and today I will be focusing on innovation and how it's talked about specifically in research. So I will make a presentation of a recent book chapter on organizational innovation that I published with Karl-Erik Sveiby about a year ago. First, I will give you a background to the study and then focus on the findings from the study. Finally, I'd like to make some conclusions and raise briefly some issues what I think that we as scholars must do to make organizational innovation more sustainable in the future. So that will be my what I will talk about when I conclude. But let's start with the actual presentation. So first, I would like to ask you to think of one or several words that best describe innovation in your opinions. I will be quiet for a few seconds just to give you a chance to think of one or a few words. Okay, so I'm guessing that at least some of you were able to find a describing word for innovation. And I myself actually did a search on new books earlier this week on internet and found several words that I think are interrelated but describe innovation. And innovation is, as you know, a widely debated phenomenon, but it's often portrayed, and these are words really from this week that I found from recent books. So innovation is often portrayed as unleashing our creative mindset. So maybe some of you thought about creativity when you just thought about innovation. It's about finding exceptional solutions to any challenge, unbeatable business, radical success, perhaps transforming an industry. Often they talk about that innovation can transform any industry. It's the future. Innovation, we will see innovation in the future. Innovation is taking us there. Innovation is the future already today. It's making the best products. Technology is very often connected or thought of as innovation, breakthroughs, and prosperity. So here are quite a few words. And if you want to learn more about it, I suggest you check out the thousands and thousands of books published on innovation. For example, on Amazon.com, they say they have over 40,000 books, but I suspect that it's a lot more. They just say that it's more than 40,000. So there's a lot to read. But as I already mentioned earlier, our interest in our research has been on what is the dominant understanding of innovation in innovation research. In other words, which words or meanings do researchers typically ascribe to innovation? And I think it's interesting for many reasons, for example, because it directs what actually happens in practice too. So it's not just interesting to look at research for the sake of looking at research, but it also says something about what happens in society, because we produce knowledge for organization and society at large. But typically innovation research shows that or assumes that innovation is good, but it's for the organization. So the dominant discourse in innovation management research looks at innovation as good for the organization, how the organization can benefit from innovation. So the faith in the goodness of innovation often drives organizations to innovate faster and faster and faster in order to create more and more beneficial effects for the organization. And this in turn tends to create this reinforcing circle that you have to innovate more and more and faster and faster. But what seems to be of little interest here in innovation research are the effects that we see outside the organization in society, but also for the employees in the organizations. So in sum, if we look at innovation research broadly, innovation is typically understood or discursively constructed, as we say in our research, as something that is very important to society and is described and understood in very positive terms. So innovation research tends to embrace and build on these assumptions, or this assumption. It has also been called the pro-innovation bias in critical innovation studies. It's about viewing innovation in a very optimistic way. And I think it's very important that we as scholars understand that this is a very narrow construction. If we focus on something, if we have a pro-innovation bias, it means that there's certain things that we don't see. So I think when something becomes very narrow, it's important that social scientists and like-minded researchers think about that. Is there a need for critical analysis of discourses of innovation? Do we, for example, need to include more often negative consequences of innovations in our studies? I'm sorry, now there's something on my screen that, yep, now I can, sorry, there was something that popped up, but it's gone now. Okay, so Karl-Erik Sveibu and I and some other researchers like Karin Berglund that we have worked with have made some attempts to address negative consequences of innovation, for example, in a recent book chapter. So this is a book chapter by Sveibu and myself. And the aim of this book chapter is to explore irresponsible organizing by analyzing how academic researchers talk about negative consequences of organizational innovation. And this book chapter has been published in this book that you can see here, the Transformative Action for Sustainable Outcomes, Responsible Organizing. Okay. Before I present the findings from this book chapter, let me define some central concepts. So what is organizational innovation? It is perhaps a new product, a service, or production process technology, perhaps a new structure in the organization, administrative systems, or it can be a plan, a program, a policy, something like this for the organizational members and their work practices. So it's typically, or you sort of typically adopt these things to create change in the organization in order then to improve the performance effectiveness of the adopting organization. So taking things into organizations to create change and to make things more efficient. That's a short definition. You can make it much more complicated, but I think this is enough for today, or for understanding what we've been looking at in our research. Irresponsible organizing is another central concept for us, and that is organizational innovation practices through which managers try to secure their corporation's survival in the accelerating global competitive race, while giving little attention to how their solutions may affect stakeholders inside and or outside the organization. So we had the circle before around innovation, and we are interested not in the benefits of the organizational innovation within the organization, but what happens to employees, what happens more broadly. Okay. The methodology that we have used, what we've done is a literature review, of course, because we've been interested in what researchers think about innovation, how they construct it, how they talk about it. So we searched for research on negative consequences of organizational innovation in quite a few journals, 288, and 12 academic books. This was the work that this empirical part was done by Karl-Erik Sveib. And we found 146 papers, which is a lot to look at, but it's not very much when you consider how large the field of organizational innovation is. So enough to analyze, but not very much when you think of how much research is done on innovation. We base our analysis, or we draw in our analysis, on critical discursive psychology. I won't go more into that, but what we looked for were discourses. And in our case, this meant that we looked at coherent ways of talking about organizational innovation, dominant way of talking about organizational innovation, and social actors, such as leaders, employees, and stakeholders. We also looked for different tensions. In critical discursive psychology, we talk about ideological dilemmas, but it's really about tensions in and between different discourses or constructions or ways of talking about organizational innovation and social actors. Yeah. So then to my findings. I hope this background helps you to understand what I'm going to talk about now, but please ask me if there's more you need to know about the background. But what we've done is we have summarized our findings in a narrative. So first, Karl-Erik identified common themes or discourses in the reviewed literature, in these 146 articles. Then he selected, and I sort of got more and more involved at this stage. So we selected quotes that best illustrate these themes, the common themes that had been identified. And then we used these quotes for constructing a narrative. So we started putting these together in a way so that the narrative describes central findings from our review of research of negative consequences of organizational innovation. So I will show you parts of this narrative to illustrate the most central findings that we had. The first theme that we've looked at is innovation-driven productivity. And this we have not yet identified so clearly in the research that looks at negative consequences. So this we have identified in mainstream organizational innovation literature. So I will read now a narrative describing productivity that is driven by innovation. And you will see words in bold, and these words are the ones are direct quotes from the literature that we have analyzed. So you can see that we have sort of put together these bolded parts into a narrative. Okay, so here's the first one. The board of the large European technology firm TI, which is a fictional firm, is pressured by competition and financial markets to be more innovative and to improve performance. The CEO therefore implements an organizational innovation, which will give a strategic advantage, a sophisticated enterprise resource planning system, which is often called an ERP, which will standardize, integrate, and automate the business processes. Profitability increases and the firm's share price rises. The CEO is lauded in the financial press, and most of staff are enthusiastic about interacting directly with a computerized system and new opportunities and challenges. However, several factory employees become unemployed due to technological change. So here you see the quotes and the narrative, how they typically fit in, how they sort of link to each other in the literature on, or in mainstream literature on organizational innovation. So one could say that a central starting point in mainstream innovation literature is a conceptualization of innovation as good for the economy, the business, and the society. For example, here we saw how TI strives to enhance or improve productivity by implementing an organizational innovation. And this is what we mean when we talk about innovation-driven productivity, that this is what the aim, this is what the research typically is about. The research sees organizational innovation as a solution to improving performance. And if we look at the actors that are put into this narrative, we can see that the CEO is represented as a hero, while the staff is categorized as either enthusiastic employees or as unemployed. When we start looking at negative consequences, the story and narrative looks a little bit different. So the second theme we've looked at is work intensification, the work intensification discourse. And this we have identified in organizational innovation literature on negative consequences. And now I will again read a short narrative. That which is bolded are quotes from the research that we have analyzed. So the employees soon find that the organizational innovation ERP intensify the work pace and create new tasks to complete, thus requiring greater intensive and extensive efforts than before. Managers complain about increased demands. Employees accept these consequences and are generally satisfied because they are informed that research shows labor-saving innovations can lead to gains in international competitiveness. However, while the accelerating pace of change appears to increase productivity and to have positive consequences for employees, many feel stress and anxiety, confusion, and reduced job satisfaction. Okay, so what can we see in this literature then? Well, research of negative consequences show that organizational innovation can contribute to work intensification. There's a fair bit of research on this. For example, managers are often surprised by how complex it is to implement organizational innovations. While employees can accept the changes, but over time, they tend to experience more stress and dissatisfaction, frustration, and so on. So the articles we reviewed about negative consequences of organizational innovation discuss this type of work intensification. And they show, for example, how employees become stressed or ill subjects rather than being primarily enthusiastic and heroes as they were presented in the mainstream research about innovation-driven productivity. Then we have a third theme, unpredictability of technology implementation. And again, this is literature that we have or these come from literature on negative consequences. So here is a third and final part of our narrative. The ERP system is highly complex and contains latent errors, which are bugs that appear long after the installation when stressed users or employees operate the system in ways unforeseen. Soon, the first errors surface as major adverse outcomes. Unwittingly, the board of the company had become a victim of the bandwagon effect. That is, they adopted certain organizational innovations, this ERP, mainly because many other organizations did the same. Not because there was a huge need for it, but there was a trend and a fashion. So insufficient investment for implementation and training, a poor design undermined the productivity gains and added more pain. The staff report undesirable psychosocial factors at work, such as loss of control. T-High was stuck in the well-known productivity paradox, which is the failure of technology investment to increase productivity. The board was essentially living an illusion through a self-chosen and partly self-constructed one. So what do we learn from this then? Well, studies of negative consequences of organizational innovation illustrate many cases of unpredictability of technology implementations. There are latent errors that appear, and over time also bugs start to disturb work. And why is this? Well, leaders or decision makers in organization typically draw on the pro-innovation bias. They have a faith in the system's productivity gains, and they neglect latent errors. And here, then, if we look at the social actors involved here, we can see that the decision makers or leaders are identified as management fashion followers. What the other organizations do, they start managing in the same way, and in that sense they follow different fashions, management fashions, but they're quite unsuccessful here often in increasing productivity. And employees are portrayed as victims of the productivity paradox as they struggle under pressure and stress and loss of control. We have more longer narrative, but I will sort of try to I have tried to sort of summarize the main points there, because having seen all this, at least we were interested in how the productivity paradox is dealt with in the organization that different researchers have looked at. And what we see, or I call it serial innovation with little reflection. So let me explain what I mean with this. It seems like few organizations investigate and research carefully the causes of difficult situations that they find themselves in, because they tend to have new pressing concerns that become the top priority. So when one organizational innovation fails, they might not have time to start looking at that. They move forward to solve another problem. And often then a chain of organizational innovation develops. So organizations, for example, outsource production, they implement new IT systems over and over again. They adopt, for example, teleworking supported by mobile technologies and so on. So it's not that they do something once, but they become serial innovators by doing this while having very little time for reflection. And when we see this, we can see that the productivity paradox remains in some organizations very clear and present all the time. We see that there's a constant sort of innovation-driven productivity thought in organizations or in the research that we looked at. We see a lot of work intensifications if we sort of keep on innovating and bringing in new innovations constantly. And technology implementation can always be unpredictable. So the serial innovation doesn't really deal with the problems of these discourses or these themes that we have identified. So this may result in activities which generate innovation in an accelerated pace rather than producing reflection and dealing with the causes of negative consequences of innovation. And this in turn produces further negative consequences, failed projects, more frustration, dissatisfaction, and stress at worst. So these were our themes, the narratives, and now I'd like to draw a few conclusions, and I think I'm running out of time soon too, so it's good that we have gotten this far. So in sum, we can conclude it has not become easier for management in organizations to act responsibly. This is because organizations are often caught in an institutionalized, ever accelerating innovation race focused on productivity with little opportunities to reflect on or deal with dilemmas. And they have very little help from the pro-innovation bias organizational innovation literature. This is sort of our main conclusion, that if we only produce research, or mainly, I mean, there are many critical studies as well, but for as long as a large body of this field of research don't deal with negative consequences and don't look at that, the organizations will have very little help from scholars and from researchers. So critical innovation studies focus on negative consequences and highlight the dark side or dark sides of organizational innovation. And that's why we need to sort of, or I would encourage more researchers to engage in this research because it's very important. And this body of research claims that negative consequences on workers' health and well-being and on working environments should not be ignored, as it has been in many cases done so far. If academic organization innovation studies challenge the dominant pro-innovation discourses and explore alternatives and more responsible paths for organizational innovations, they could play a transformative role. They could enhance sustainability. And this would contribute towards more responsible organizing by drawing more attention to how to prevent or to reduce negative consequences of innovations. And this would also help organizations to increase the net positive effect of their efforts for society. And the potential is enormous here because there's not that much research on this yet. Within this field, we have neighboring research fields, of course, that look at sustainability questions and undesirable and negative consequences. But within the innovation field, we need to bring in this type of research because the innovation field has had a huge influence on management and organizations in society. I also want to say it now, I should probably have said it earlier, that we're not anti-innovation, but rather this last sentence catches is that the net positive effects will be higher if we consider both negative and positive effects and consequences. Now, I understand that my time is out. I will just show here are two books that if you're interested, you might find some interesting work in this, Challenging the Innovation Paradigm and Critical Studies of Innovation. So I will finish here and thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Beata. That was a wonderful presentation. I think very insightful for our interdisciplinary group here today. It's also nice to hear, we live in a time where indeed there's this innovation bias that we all presuppose innovation is good. I work myself in a business school where, students are steered towards innovating and becoming the next innovator of our age. But at the same time, it's really important to also have this critical reflection that you've shared here today. I would like to remind the audience that you are free to post questions in the chat, either in English or Portuguese or even Spanish, and I'll do my best to pose them. to Beata. And as you do that, I will take the opportunity to maybe open up with a first question. I think it's really interesting that you highlight the dark side of innovation, if you will, as you mentioned at the end, and focusing on somewhat a critical perspective on the potential negative effects. But I was also wondering, let's say if irresponsible organization is focusing on the negative effects, then what would responsible organization entail? Is that by default meaning limiting the negative effects, or does it also go beyond the effects? And the reason I'm asking this is because in the literature there's a distinction between ethics of constraints and ethics of construction. So ethics of constraints usually refers to trying to focus on the harm, on avoiding the harm and avoiding negative effects. But ethics of construction somewhat goes beyond this consequence paradigm and tries to think, okay, maybe we shouldn't only focus on what we shouldn't do, but also focus on what we could do. And I think this maybe links to what you said at the end, like the potential of innovation as well, of organization, or innovation for organizations as well. So I was wondering how you see this.
Well, it sounds like you're a bigger expert on this than I am, so maybe we should collaborate further on this. But I agree. I'm not an expert on what organizations should do. We have more looked at what researchers say about this. So I think that's a potential really to sort for researchers to study these different aspects and share it. So if we can make our way of looking at this more nuanced, looking at harm, also how can we work with these types of questions, we can sort of help organizations to be more sustainable and to address these things. So I guess I don't think there is one solution, but I think there is. It starts with sort of becoming aware of the pro-innovation bias. Being aware of the focus has been very much on organizational benefits and broadening it. So it depends, of course, what you're doing in your organization, but really thinking about different stakeholders, different perspectives, long-term, short-term, looking at the consequences that can be direct and they can be intended or unintended. They can be negative or positive from that. But then indirect, so we have the direct, but then it sort of continues and travel and we come to the indirect effect as well, which feeds back to innovation and goes around like this. So I don't know if you answered the question, and we come from slightly different disciplines. And that's why it's important that we also have this dialogue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's also an interesting direction to talk about direct effects, indirect effects, and also in the context of unintended consequences, which definitely takes place when we talk about innovation. You also again mentioned the innovation bias, and I think it was in this context that one of our members in the audience, Georgia, mentioned that usually innovation has a connection with industry and money, and I guess making money. Do you think that this is part of this innovation bias, and what else could this bias consist of?
Absolutely, it is. And it's, if we think about this innovation-driven productivity, if we think that innovation will solve our problems and it will make us more efficient and more productive, we see innovation as a solution. As long as we only see it in those terms, and we don't look at things that, for example, these studies and look at negative consequences show, the pro-innovation will be very, very strong. And it's very hard to, I don't think we can escape the pro-innovation bias, because innovation has a lot of, or I would say that innovation is crucial for social development, for social movements, for social justice, for the environment, and so on. We need innovation for that, but we need to look at it more in a more nuanced way. That's the most important thing, I think, that we are not too narrow-minded. And so far it has been. I think there are a lot of good things going on globally today that challenge the innovation, the pro-innovation bias, but it's we still have a lot of things. There's still a lot of things to be done. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's kind of like a positive evolution, but we're not there yet.
Well, it's too slow. I think there are very many good things, but it's too slow. We really need to sort of challenge the innovation bias faster
Yeah.
to make the world more sustainable.
Yeah. Oh, that's loud and clear. And I think meanwhile we're getting some more really interesting questions. So one is from Nicole about whether there are any examples of critical organizational innovation studies that have been conducted in partnership with organizations. Do you know of any of those studies?
I'm thinking we should probably have had Karl-Erik Sveiby here today, but he couldn't unfortunately make it. He's my expert on this specific studies. I could, if you're interested, I could save this question, and I will let you know. I could send some examples that maybe Tiago can share with you. But I'm sure there are several good examples. Yeah, I just can't mention them right now.
No, brilliant. That'd be great. I think Tiago will be happy to share those with everyone. Melissa mentions in the chat, she appreciates the subject that you're touching upon, and she was wondering if we can consider this sense of innovation also as part of organizational violence, or even part of organizational bureaucracy. I guess might be hinting to another subject, but
I'm sure they are theorizing that could, not in all cases, but some of these could perhaps see it as organizational violence. Sure, it depends on what we refer to, but in many cases when we talk about the employees and how they're treated, so definitely. I'm thinking about the bureaucracy part here. I think a lot of these problems are structural. We have dominant discourses, understandings in society on what drives innovation, the economy, and social development. And if we think that innovation always is a solution to things, it's very broad and it's structural, and it sort of structures how we work with, how we organize the society. And also bureaucracy is an important part of that. So it might be built into for sure is built into that. So many of these things, it can come from below, but it's also very top down and structural. And there are things that we have to work nationally with, in transnational collaboration. So so it's not just the organizations, they are very much stuck in this whole economy and way of organizing society that also drives their way of working. So it's can be very tricky because it's structural. So it's a very good question.
Yeah, no, a good question and a good answer. Another question is from Nicole again, who asks what the most pressing issues you think academia can help organizations deal with when it comes to irresponsible innovation.
I think understanding, I'm always coming back to the pro-innovation bias or discourse. Understanding, first we need to understand how we look at the world before we can start working with it. But also probably finding good examples and sort of just giving more voice to this and visibility and discussing and showing examples and showing what the problematic part is. I think engaging in debates is very, very important. So maybe that is what we can do. But for as long as we have thousands and thousands of books that completely ignore these parts, it's very difficult for organizations to find better solutions from researchers.
yeah, so while we have 40,000, was it 40,000 books on Amazon?
More than. I think it might be double, actually. Yeah.
So all about talking how good innovation is, then we might need to add some to that list, but then on the critical side as well.
Yes.
No, fantastic. I think on that note, let me see if there are any other final questions. No, I think we've covered them, and I'm also a bit mindful of time. So I would like to thank you again, Beata, for a wonderful talk, and also engaging with the questions. Nicole is thanking you, Melissa as well as others. So that's good to see. So yes, thank you again, and then I would smoothly transition to our next speaker, who has come into the image. I'm referring to Lee Vinsel, who is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. And he is researching, broadly speaking, human life with technology, and a particular focus on the relationship it takes place between governments, businesses, and technological change in a general sense. So Lee, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to enjoy your talk as well. So without further ado,
thanks for having me.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. And being on video is making me realize how bad I need a haircut. So sorry about that, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. Let me see if I can. Yeah, let me just test this out real quick. Yeah, great. So I'm going to start a timer. I'm going to guarantee to be under time here. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here, and I'm especially glad to be presenting to this group. It's exciting to me, and there's reasons why. I mean, I think I'm looking down the road to things happening that I hope will happen in the next couple of years, and will be happening in the next couple of years. And I wrote this kind of new talk because what I want to do is kind of talk to you about what you're interested in and things we might be able to look in together. So as I say here, the spirit of this talk is I want to come and hang out and learn from you. Including in person eventually. And so these are some initial thoughts about what we might discuss. And the other kind of dimension is that, I gave another talk for, we've talked about the journal Critical Innovation Studies before, and this talk's going to kind of build on one I gave for another conference that was held on the thinking of Benoit Godin, who's has been is kind of foundationally influential on how I think about innovation and thinking and talking about innovation over the last couple hundred years, and even before that. And that talk was kind of about my, all I learned from Benoit, and also my kind of creative differences with him. And so this talk is going to continue to build on that. And so, first of all, I would just, if you have not read or looked at Benoit's stuff before, I would encourage you to do so. And just to give you kind of basic roadmap for my comments today, as I said, I wrote this new, so I just wanted to give you some thoughts of the structure of what's coming. I'm going to talk a bit about my own work, where I've been, where I'm at today. Then I'm going to give some thoughts about methods for what I call materialist studies of technology and innovation. I'm using this word materialist to make a distinction that'll clarify. And then I'm actually want to end with a section about thinking about technology and innovation studies in Latin America and other areas, not in the kind of rich Western or just rich nations like Japan, places that are kind of less studied in the technology and innovation literature, and ways about going about that. And so just to give you some preview, my thoughts about methods are going to lead into thinking about, well, what do we do? How do we continue to building wonderful literatures on technology and innovation in Latin America? and in other places. And that's something conversations I very much want to be a part of. So just a bit about me. My first book, Moving Violations, which builds on my dissertation, is a history of automobile regulation in the United States. And it goes from 1893, when the first internal combustion engine driven vehicle was built in the United States, to basically the present, when I finished writing the book, and it ends with the Google car, so fantasies of self-driving cars. And it's really about how government action or regulation shape technological change, and especially how governments use some things called standards, performance standards, to positively shape vehicles around safety, pollution control, and fuel economy. So cars today are much safer than they used to be. They pollute much less, so they still pollute too much. They pollute much less, and they use less fuel than they used to. And so the question is, how did that happen? And then while I was writing that, I also wrote this book with my friend Andy Russell called The Innovation Delusion: How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most. And that book is a critique of innovation, ways of talking about innovation. And in that book, we also focus on how focusing too much on innovation leads us to neglect other things, including the maintenance or repair of things that already exist, and the people who do that kind of anonymous work, the people we call the maintainers, the people who do all the work that just keeps the world going. And a crucial distinction in the innovation delusion, which I'm also going to be riffing on and playing with in various ways today, is the difference between what we call innovation speak and what we call actual innovation. So actual innovation is the introduction of new things and business models and practices into society. It's often distinguished from, invention, which is just the creation of a new idea or technology. Innovation is the diffusion of those things out into society, and it can create all kinds of benefits. But importantly, and I'll show you a slide on this in a bit, our use of the word innovation only in English only started to tick up after World War II. And then the question is why? And what we show in the book is that there's a distinction between actual innovation and innovation speak. And often innovation speak doesn't lead to more actual innovation. And actual innovation, if we think about new technologies and business models, have been going on for 150, 200 years in a big way through the Industrial Revolution and such, long before we started talking about innovation. So that's another way of questioning innovation speak, the way Beata was kind of doing with her discourse analysis. So that project then has led me to my new book project, which is called A Good History of Shit Jobs. And how I got onto this book is that as we were writing The Innovation Delusion, we started working with a nonprofit organization here in the United States called United Way. And they have this program called United for Alice. Alice is an acronym. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's basically a measure of what you can think of as the working poor. So they have a measure for how much it costs to live in every county they study, and then they see what percentage of the population can afford to make ends meet or afford that basic living in that county. And they find that about 40% of American households can barely afford to make ends meet. And then the question of the book is, why is that? And the hypothesis that I'm working with is the reason Americans struggle financially so much is because, and working Americans, by the way, I'm not talking about people who aren't working, is because the American economy is full of poorly paid, poorly benefited, what I call shit jobs. And that's the last time I'll use profanity. So then the question is why? And that the question why the US economy is so full of bad jobs is the core of the book. Now, as part of this book, I am doing intellectual history in a kind of Benoit mode. I mean, so some of my first studies for that book are about how various American elites, including ones who influence policymaking at the federal and state level, thought about the US economy, what was happening with technology, what was happening with global competitiveness, such as the rise of Japan's economy and then the rise of China's economy. And so part of what I'm doing is intellectual history. And there's good reasons to do this work because, you know, concepts like technology have had big influences on society. So technology is also a word that in English primarily is a post-World War II phenomenon and really takes off from the 1960s. We can talk about why it went down later if you want to. But technology, the concept, the word really takes off in the post-World War II period. This guy, I'm sorry, Robert Reich, the guy I'm writing about here, who was the Secretary of Labor under US President Bill Clinton. He wrote a bunch of books. He's one of many people in the 1980s and 1990s who are obsessed with technological change and think, for instance, that digital technologies leading to all kinds of massive social changes, even when he doesn't have good evidence for believing that. And in fact, the evidence points in the other direction, which is related to the productivity paradox that Beata was talking about earlier. Another example is the concept of innovation, okay? And as I said, if we look at, and I'm sorry, I should have introduced this a bit better. These two slides, what I'm showing you is this freely available tool. You can go do it, find it yourself. It's called Google Ngram, that's Ngram. I'm pretty sure it only works in English, but I'm not sure about that because I haven't done research in other languages with it. But what we're seeing here is word use over time. So this is not innovation over time. This is not showing actual innovation increasing. This is showing use of the word innovation increasing ever more. And so you can see that the Ngram goes from the year 1800 to the year 2019. And what it's showing is that use of the word innovation starts going up in the 1960s. There's steep periods like the 60s and the 90s, but basically use of the word innovation just keeps going up and up and up right to the present. And yet, if we look at measures of the economy, the US economy, as the use of the word innovation is going up, we don't see innovation showing up in economic measures in any kind of objective way. So this chart I'm showing you here is a measure called total factor productivity. How they do this, and can be controversial, and I can go into it later. But it's one measurement that economists use to look at innovation and technological change and how it affects the economy, right? So the idea is, as productivity increases, we become more efficient. And what this chart is showing you is that between 1920 and 1970, there's this period of massive technological change and productivity gains. And then, from 1970 to 1994, there's, productivity hits the skids. You enter a period of economic stagnation. Then from about 1994 to 2004, we have what's called the new economy, which is this period of not nearly as high as the pre-1970 productivity growth, but it was better than nothing. And then from 2004 to 2014, it's very low. Okay, productivity improvement is very low, and that cuts off at 2014. But it being low continues right up to the present. In fact, like the first 2 quarters of 2022, there was negative productivity. So this is a measure of actual technological change and innovation. Supposedly it's a proxy for that. It's not showing actual innovation increasing ever more, and yet talk of innovation is increasing ever more. And this is a tension that I think is worth playing out. And in fact, when I'm teaching a graduate methods course this semester, and I'm really starting to lean into, we need to be clear about what we're studying and how we're doing it. And just like earlier, I talked about innovation speak, the way we talk and think, about innovation on one level, and then actual material change or actual innovation on another. These are two different things, okay? And I'm not saying they're not related, of course. If I was a better artist, those arrows would look more beautiful. But ideas and our thinking about the world obviously does lead to material change, because we enact plans and do all kinds of things. And material change, I also think, because I'm kind of, a materialist, it also, I believe material change affects the way we think about the world, right? Material change shows up, and then we have to think about what's going on. So material change influences thought too. But I think often we get very stuck in my fields, at least in the history of technology and STS, at the level of ideas and discourses, and we've gotten not so great. We're often not so great at studying actual material change. And this is what I kind of want to play out with you. So first of all, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that when discourse analysis is done well, it can't include material analysis. I want to be clear about that. Even if we think about Foucault and other kinds of thinkers, when we think about discourse, that is what people are saying about the world, that includes material change too. But so often our analyses don't. So first of all, I'm not saying discourse analysis can't be materialist. So don't at me, bro, about that. That's not what I'm saying. But too often our analyses of technology and innovation end up getting stuck in people's heads, basically. We're dealing with head and talk stuff. And we're not focusing on material change or thinking about how to study that material change. Now, just to be a little controversial, I think a lot of discourse analysis comes from the French philosopher Michel Foucault. I partly blame this getting stuck in noggins thing on him. I think if we read the book Discipline and Punish carefully, Foucault talks about what he calls the microphysics of power, which is how power works in the world at very microscopic levels. And that sounds great. I get really excited. It's like, oh, we're going to look at materialist practices. But then if you actually read the text, what we're mostly getting is elites thinking about prisons and punishment. Okay, we are mostly in the thoughts of elites. We don't actually see how things are playing out in the ground in prisons. And I think, unfortunately, many of the people who kind of, at least in the United States, many of the people who got really into Foucault are not nearly as smart as he is. And that problem of remaining in people's noggins just gets worse, in fact. So, briefly, I thought I would do some jokes. Here's two Marx dad jokes. The first one is, oh, I am a Marxist, a Groucho Marxist. And that's because, as Groucho Marx says, I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member. I don't know how well Groucho Marx is known in Brazil and Latin America, but probably the most important thing that could come out of this talk is that if you don't know the Marx Brothers, then you should go check some out. And the second Marx joke is, I may not be a Marxist, but I'm Marx-ish. And that's because while I can't bring myself to believe in the labor theory of value, I am a historical materialist. And the tension between ideology and actual states of the world, I believe, lies at the heart of materialist critique. If we go back to Marx and long lines of materialist thinking, what they're doing is showing that elite conceptions of the world aren't matching up with what's happening in the world. But to do that work, we have to look at what's happening in the world. So then the question is, how do we do materialist technology studies? And I'm teaching as I said, a graduate qualitative research methods seminar in my STS department this semester. I'm methods agnostic, so I tend to do historical work. So that's document analysis in this list, but I teach students how to do interviews. I teach students how to do ethnography. I think we can use all these methods to study material change. In general, I think STS in the history of technology, we need to do more mixed and quantitative methods work to study material change, but we're going to have to learn new skills to do that work. Now, I think that it's helpful to have heroes when we're thinking. And so some heroes for me, I keep going back to the very famous French Annales School of History. If any of you are historians out there, you know that they were very important for creating the field of social history and economic history, which involves counting dead people and looking at their health and trying to measure economies and all these kinds of things. I'm also an enormous fan of the historian Adam Tooze, who writes about Germany and eventually wrote about the financial crisis of 2008. And I think Tooze is a real hero because he can simultaneously write about discourse and ideas and material change. And so I think his books are kind of like handbooks of how to bring both of those aspects in. But in general, I think we need to relearn old lessons and methods for studying changes in matter, changes in the world, to focus, from old fields like social and economic history. And then, I was writing about this a bit on Twitter the last couple of days, and a kind of friendly colleague. I have a podcast called Peoples and Things. This woman, Catherine Freeman, said, Shuttlecoff, there's a whole discipline focused on the material of past technologies. She's an archaeologist. She's talking about archaeology. So I think the point is that in technology studies, we need to learn from all kinds of fields and to think about the material world. But what if instead of creating our own numbers, we just start with numbers that are laying around, that we can find in the world in various places, even just online, frankly. So I think that, we have to be critical in our use of numbers that are laying around. There are a lot of numbers laying around that we can lean on, and we should, I think. But they've also been used in oppression. We can think of GDP as an example, and the way it's, measures of growth, economic growth, are used by the IMF and these various groups in all kinds of terrible neoliberal debt politics and stuff. But even after we've interrogated those concepts and showed how they have bad politics, I think we can still use them. And so I'll give it a couple examples. This is an article I wrote with a colleague named Jeff Funk. It's called Blinded by the Hype. And what we show in this is that while there's all this kind of hype around AI, NFTs, blockchain, and these all kinds of new technologies, if we look at the market sizes, that is how quickly the overall revenues around these new technologies are growing, their market sizes are very slow, especially when compared to older technological breakthroughs like e-commerce. E-commerce grew very fast, very quickly. These new technologies that are very hyped are not growing very fast at all. So there's all these numbers laying around that you can use to make materialist arguments. There's GDP, there's total factor productivity, there's issues of market size and market capitalization. There's all these things, okay? And what Jeff Funk and I did is we were drawing, thank you very much for the compliment. I really appreciate it. What we did is, we took things like market size and market capitalization and things like firm profitability and indebtedness to show that, contrary to all the hype, it's just not living up to it, right? That's an example. And so then I think, we can look to other fields, like how do social historians look at this? So, if we look back at the British Industrial Revolution, for instance, there's a very big literature on to what degree the British Industrial Revolution raised, or fed people, raised their living standards, got rid of hunger, dealt with poverty. And they use very quantitative methods of various sorts and do work to kind of show, answer the questions around that. And here's an example of an article I really love by Johann Matthew. It's in the journal History Compass. It's called Embodied Capital in the History of Inequality. It's from a special issue on Thomas Piketty's Capital and Ideology. And what it shows is that in the United States, if you look at inequality, it has terrible, terrible health impacts on poor people, including diabetes and heart disease. And these things are very, it's all tied up with race and gendered and all this kind of stuff, but inequality is very hard on the human body and leads to suffering. And we can show that in all kinds of very strong ways. So, then this leads to, questions of population and biological health markers. We can critique a lot of this stuff, come out from a kind of Foucauldian biopower perspective of like, well, these stats were made by governments to control populations. But at the same time, if we're interested in material change and how technological change led to economic and material change, we can still use these things to ask questions and to answer questions too. And so, we could keep going on. We can think of measures of happiness and well-being. I tend to think these measures are not very strong scientifically, but we could just keep going on of like, well, should we bring these into the mix if we're thinking about economic change in Chile or Brazil or wherever? One thing I don't want to hear about when we're talking about innovation is buildings, because whenever people, whenever schools do new innovation policies or whatever, they build new big glass covered buildings. But as my colleague, Matt Wisnowski and I showed in this article, The Campus Innovation Myth, there's no evidence that innovation campuses actually lead to innovation or economic growth. So I don't really want to hear about buildings in themselves. Usually I want to hear about measures of innovation and economic growth. So, and then I'll just, as a way of transition, my question is, what measures do you think are worth using in materialist technology and innovation studies? We could think of housing, neighborhood stuff. We could think of all kinds of things. So now this is my final section. I have a timer going here. I have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to get it done in under that. What's the thing about doing technology studies and innovation studies beyond the West and other rich nations, and especially in Latin America? There's some people who've influenced me very deeply. David Edgerton and his book, Shock of the Old, and maybe more important, his essay, From Innovation to Use, is very important to me because it really starts to focus on how are people using technologies in different places on the planet, including Latin America and Africa and Asia, these places that, many American and European historians are just never talking about. And this is another very important study to me. It builds on Edgerton. It's by Young-Sub Choi. It's called The Social Construction of Imported Technologies, and it's about Korea. And Choi's point is that we have to learn how to study how nations that do not create technologies use technologies, and that too is a process of social construction. And I would like to talk about this more maybe, but I think we need to think about the systemic and epistemic racism in the history of technology in STS and how we're not kind of listening to other places. I was going to talk about this book, but this guy just got canceled for being a terrible sexist and yada yada, so I'm just going to skip it. And then where I want to end is by talking about these two lovely people, Fernando Rosa and Fabian Prieto Nanez. These are my colleagues here at Virginia Tech. I love them very much. I'm honored to have them as coworkers, and I learn a tremendous amount from them. Fernanda is doing works on how indigenous peoples in Mexico and elsewhere are adopting internet systems by stealing it, or building systems to draw on the internet into their indigenous communities. And it's very interesting stuff. And Fabian is also looking at Colombia and now elsewhere, the Caribbean and Mexico, looking at how people pirated satellite television. So, one of the things that connects these Fabian and Fernanda is an example of a shared team is the role of informal and illegal practices in provisioning modern infrastructures, right? So the point is that, sometimes we look at informal and illegal and black market stuff as backwards, but actually in these situations, it's provisioning, modernity. It's bringing people modernity through these informal processes. Now, where I want to kind of end up is one of Fabian's longer term projects, and this is something I talked to Tiago about too, is an intellectual history of how Latin American thinkers conceptualize technologies and economies. And the whole point here is that we should not be kind of automatically applying Western academic concepts, whether co-production or social construction of technology, or even our own conceptions of innovation to other places. This can be a kind of form of neocolonialism in itself. We have to, we have to learn how to study how people in other places thought about technology and the economy in their own terms. And to do that, we have to rethink, and I could go on about this more, but as Fabian points out and others he works with point out, the word social, as in social innovation, means different things in Latin America than it does in like Stanford, where the Social Innovation Journal is. And, words like innovation and technology, the economy, all these words that I just used to kind of set it up, they all have different meanings. So we have to reconstruct how people in these other places were thinking about these things. And I think this is a a worthwhile project. And so I have less than a minute left. What I want to say is what interests me is how we can best apply humanistic and social scientific methods. I'm a methods nerd. This is what I want to talk about, is how to study things, to understanding technological and economic change, as well as the concepts, technology, the discourses about these things, wherever we choose to look at on that place's own way of thinking about these things. And, I hope we have a chance to meet and chat in the future, including the Society for the History of Technology, I believe is being held in Santiago in 2024. So, the question, part of what I want to set up here is like, well, what's worth examining together, and how do we kind of have conversations through these kind of methods and concepts and stuff. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. So thank you so much again for having me.
Excellent, Lee. Thank you so much for a really thought-provoking talk, and yet again a very insightful talk as well. It's like Thiago mentions in the chat. I think you really mentioned about the need to develop further our methodologies to actually really understand innovation, and at the same time we had Beata, who also really calls for such type of studies as well. Before we dive into the questions and the discussions, I want to pose you the most important one. Are you a Marxist or are you Marxish?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, like, I was a philosophy undergrad, right? And so I studied continental philosophy, European philosophy, and so it was like Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, every class basically. And I'm deeply influenced by Marx, but I've just never been able to like keep the faith, you know what I mean? But I'm deeply influenced by him, and I think materialist analysis is the way to go.
Yeah. No, I think I can relate to that. Maybe just also to clarify, because you put a lot of emphasis on materialism and the materialist approach. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with that. At one point you mentioned that that material change, for example, can really affect the way we think. Could you maybe clarify a little bit what that entails?
Sure. Yeah, so when I should have to define this. When I use the term materialism, I mean two things. I mean changes in things like metals, in our ability to control metals and our ability to make machines, and also the social relations around that. So like who owns companies, where are the managers, where are the workers? And so when I talk about materialism, I'm talking about both the social relations and the stuff, okay? And just as one simple example of material change affecting thinking or giving rise to problems that thinking solves. This is my doctoral advisor, David Hounshaw's book, From the American System to Mass Production. And so it's about the rise of mass production, like Henry Ford and stuff like that, right? Well, the last chapter in the book is about kind of moral and political responses to mass production, and includes a discussion of like Charlie Chaplin. So not Groucho Marx, but Charlie Chaplin, the other kind of like a silent film comedian. Hopefully folks know who he is. And so, in a number of movies, Chaplin criticized mass production. So that would be an example of like, the world changes and then there's responses to it. And that's what I was trying to get at with that point. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for clarifying that. So I realize Beata has entered the stage as well, which is very nice. So we'll dive into a discussion shortly. I also see Tiago post some questions. Maybe Tiago, you want to enter the stage as well and participate in the discussion. And before we do that, allow for one question from the audience from Nicole, who asks you what alternatives, offers, and method-wise you would suggest so that the discourse analysis can be more concrete and less cerebral.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, even though I have this kind of materialist sensibility, Benoit remains really important to me. And it's not that discourse analysis can be great, but I think then we have to think about how to document and measure other material changes, right? And so for me, it's more that dual thing and the back and forth that matters, and not so much that we do discourse analysis in a different way. That would be my response, I think.
Great, thank you. Beata, do you have a question as well? Oh no, you're good. You're just on the stage, so that's perfect.
Yeah, somebody just, I don't know how I popped up.
Oh, you popped in. Okay.
Well, it's good to have you here. Yeah.
If we have time.
It's more inclusive. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Let me just ask another question that Nicole posed related to this. Do you believe that there are any underlying discourses in technology products, such as the codes that make up for social media, and I think with codes also algorithms, I guess, and developers' tools? And when we speak of big tech, do big tech speak through programming?
Yeah, I mean, I think this this just depends on how we define our terms. Ultimately, I think and if we want to include the code. I mean, there is discourse in code because there's notes in code, right? So there's language in code that's not like picked up by the machines. But if we want to call the actual code discourse, I mean, I think we could play that out in interesting ways, but that would not be my first instinct. And I would think, I think that when I think of material, I mean, obviously code is affecting ones and zeros, which is heating up things up and doing all kinds of stuff. So code is very much a part of my materialist picture. But I would usually separate kind of human thought from that stuff. Yeah.
Fantastic. No, thank you for responding to that. So a question from Tiago is, how inclined mainstream studies of innovation studies have been adopted to, I guess, the different methodologies, also those that you've mentioned, and also those that Beata mentioned earlier?
Well, I just want to say, I think it's cool to be at a business school, and so good for you in being one. Because I think that my friends who are kind of in organizational sociology in business schools, who study, for instance, how organizations adopt robots and ERP, Beata, and these very humdrum systems, even AI, they're doing it in a very fascinating materialist ethnographic way. And I think there's a lot of great work being done in this way in business schools. And I wish more, and this is, in STS, STS is very critical in this kind of like, we're critical studies of whatever. We take that very seriously. I'm always telling STS people, you need to learn more from business schools. And this completely freaks them out because they want to see it as like the den of evil or whatever, And I'm like, no, they're doing good work there. You should draw on what they're doing because there's a lot of fascinating work being done in business schools. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of learning that can happen between fields.
Yeah, no, that's definitely really interesting. I mean, in my case, my background is in philosophy, but I can't call myself a Marxist because somehow I landed in a business school now. No, I can definitely relate to your analysis of the business school as well. There's definitely potential to collaborate with STS philosophy more broadly. Absolutely.
Yeah, like Copenhagen Business School, as an example. I know a lot of people there. Fascinating work being done and really good work. So I'm not down with the business school bashing.
Yeah. Great. So my life is spared here. Maybe just another more practical question. You alluded on it a little bit in the talk, but you mentioned how showing that graph with technology suddenly declining over the last few years.
Yeah.
How's that? How did that?
My hunch is I think innovation actually go back to Beata's talk becomes a substitute word for this. So another one we could run together even, but people go right at is you could do technology, technological innovation. Because when you do the engram for technological innovation, you see it rising during the same period that innovation is rising. And yet it starts to fall off in the 90s around the same period that technology is falling off. So I think what happens is that innovation becomes a substitute term for technology and technological innovation. People stop saying technological innovation because they just assume innovation is technology in ways that play out in Beata's talk, actually, right? All the things that they're expecting of it. It becomes innovation instead of technology sometimes, at least part of the time.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that could definitely be an explanation. Also in light of Benoit Godin, I guess, who also really highlights how that association has been made.
Yeah.
I also see here there was another side to Tiago's earlier question, asking whether corporations and enterprises are inclined to accept sort of ethnographic studies, or, for instance, how far we can develop a sort of an entrepreneurial history in this context.
Yeah. Well, I would say, the ethnographic studies question is fascinating. Beata might have more insight here than I do. I think it's very hard to get access, but people do it. I've seen a lot of really fascinating ethnographies of startups and stuff, especially in recent years. So it's hard to gain access, but it's doable. And then I also just want to, this is where I'll give a pitch for the Business History Conference. My main conference is the Society for the History of Technology. My second one's a Business History Conference. Entrepreneurial history is huge in Business History Conference, and it's international. It started off as very US and European, but now it's really global and becoming increasingly global. So I think that we can develop a kind of history of entrepreneurship. We are doing so, and it's increasingly becoming global. And then Tiago and I like to talk about sources, and how you reconstruct this is very interesting. Sometimes it's gaining access to family papers and and archival holdings that have some small company or something. But there's other ways to do it too.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I think on that note, I would like to conclude today's really insightful session and really thank Lee and Beata in particular, both of you for sharing your insights, and also to maybe to wrap up and say that what Beata mentioned earlier, that we should do more to discuss about the dark side and critical thinking of innovation and these type of things. I guess today was one step in contributing to that direction. So yes, on that note, I would like to again thank everyone, and I look forward to the next occasion.
And thank you. I learned a lot from Beata, so that was great.
Yes, thank you. And I think we need another session on discursive material relations, and then let's bring everyone in.
It would be fun. I think it was great. I want to know what you think about these things. And also, I have an article. I have a pop piece on ChatGPT, which actually gets at some of these organizational pressures and leaders thinking through them. So I was thinking about your work as I was doing that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Bright future ahead. Great. Thanks everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.